The afternoon sun hit the neighborhood like fire, sharp and merciless, turning the asphalt roads into shimmering lines of heat. It was the kind of day when every drop of water mattered. Lawns were already fading from green to pale yellow, sprinklers hissed like tired snakes, and the faint hum of air conditioners filled the air like an endless chorus. Inside his house, the homeowner filled a glass of water, but before he could drink it, he heard the unmistakable sound of the pipes choking. At first, he thought it was a small pressure issue, maybe a temporary glitch. But as he turned the kitchen tap again, nothing came out except a low sputter and a long gasp of air. The water was gone. A sudden, quiet dread settled in his chest. He rushed outside without even closing the door behind him. The air outside was hotter, heavier, and what he saw on the edge of his property made his stomach twist. 2 heavy trucks were parked across his lawn, their engines idling with low rumbles. 3 men in safety vests and work boots stood around the well, their tools scattered like a construction site. A cement mixer whirred loudly, the gray sludge of concrete spinning inside like a living thing. The wellhead, the small, simple structure that had quietly served him for decades, was already buried beneath a thick, wet layer of gray. Standing just a few feet away, with her arms crossed and a self-satisfied smirk on her face, was Karen, the HOA president. She wore her usual neat pastel blazer and big sunglasses, the same look she always wore when she believed she was the one in control. Her clipboard rested against her chest like a soldier's shield. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted, his voice sharp with shock. The workers didn't respond. They didn't even look at him. They just kept moving the cement. One man held a hose, spraying the wet mix over the wellhead until it disappeared completely. Another smoothed it out with a trowel like he was sealing a grave. Karen took a slow, deliberate step forward, the heels of her shoes clicking against the pavement. "You're violating HOA infrastructure standards," she said calmly, like she was reading from a script she had rehearsed many times. "This unapproved structure has been reported and removed. Consider this your official notice of compliance." He stared at her, stunned. "This isn't your property," he growled. "This isn't even HOA land. This is my well. My water." Karen tilted her head slightly and gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your well was never registered with us," she replied smoothly. "It's unsightly, unapproved, and against community image. We have the authority to address violations." He took a step closer, fists clenched at his sides, fighting the urge to yell louder. "Authority doesn't give you the right to destroy what isn't yours." But she didn't flinch. She thrived on confrontation. She liked seeing people get angry. She liked being the one who caused it. The wet concrete glistened under the sun, thick and permanent. There was no way to remove it easily. They had taken something that wasn't just a piece of property. It was a part of the land itself. The well had been there before any of the fancy HOA houses, before Karen had ever existed on that street. He remembered when he first moved in. The well was the reason he bought the land in the first place. A deep, reliable source of water. No matter how many times the town rationed supply, he had always had his own. He'd shared it with neighbors quietly over the years during droughts, letting them fill barrels when water restrictions hit hard. And now they had buried it like it was trash. Karen turned to the workers and nodded. "Finish up," she said. They packed their tools like a well-practiced crew. This wasn't the first time they'd carried out her orders. She loved making examples of people, especially those who didn't bow to her rules. A few neighbors stood on their porches, whispering to each other but not daring to speak up. Everyone knew how far Karen would go. She'd find people for mailbox paint, for porch chairs, for wind chimes she claimed were too loud. But this was different. This was more than control over paint and fences. This was water. Real, essential, life-giving water. One old man across the street folded his arms tightly and muttered under his breath. A woman clutched her garden hose like it could protect her. Everyone knew something had gone too far. The homeowner felt a deep, cold anger forming in his chest. He didn't shout again. He didn't lunge forward or make a scene. Instead, he stood perfectly still, watching every second of the wet cement hardening, memorizing the smug shape of Karen's face. She thought she had one. She thought she'd taken away the one thing that made him stand apart. She didn't realize she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because that well wasn't just his. The neighborhood's main water line was quietly linked to it. Years ago, when the town supply had been unreliable, the developer had cut costs by running the community pipes through his well's filtration system. Everyone knew it existed. Nobody talked about it. And the HOA had never paid for their own independent source because they never had to. Karen had just buried their lifeline with her arrogance. The homeowner's jaw tightened. She thought this was about an unapproved structure. She didn't know she had just set the stage for something much bigger. Karen pulled off her sunglasses with dramatic satisfaction. "This is what happens when people think they're above the rules," she said loudly, loud enough for every porch to hear. "We are a community. No one gets special privileges here." She was enjoying the attention, the quiet fear in the neighbors' faces. She mistook silence for obedience. "Enjoy your next water bill," she added with a fake sweet smile, then walked back to her SUV like she had delivered justice. The workers left, the cement hardening in the heat like a permanent scar in the ground. The homeowner remained standing in the yard long after everyone else had gone inside. The wind rustled through the dry grass. The smell of wet cement was thick in the air, stinging his nose. His throat was dry. The irony of it wasn't lost on him. On the hottest day of the year, they decided to take away water. He walked over to the buried well slowly, crouched down, and touched the edge of the cement. It was still warm, soft in the middle but already beginning to harden around the edges. He pressed his thumb into it, leaving a small mark, a reminder of the moment he decided he wasn't going to let this go. This wasn't about some petty HOA rule anymore. This was about control, about what belonged to him, about what they had no right to take. He stood up and looked around the street. Curtains moved as neighbors peeked through their windows. Nobody dared step out. They all knew what it felt like to have Karen's claws dig into their lives. She was cruel and clever, the kind who used rules like weapons. But today she had crossed a line. She didn't realize that the man she was trying to crush had no intention of bowing. He walked back to his house slowly, every step deliberate. He sat at his kitchen table, pulled out his phone, and scrolled through his contacts until he reached a familiar number. It was a number he hadn't called in years, one tied not to some local handyman or lawyer, but to people with authority much bigger than Karen's HOA board. He didn't make the call yet. He just stared at the number, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the street. The cement cooled into a hard shell. Karen probably thought she'd sleep easy tonight, certain she'd broken the one man she couldn't control. She didn't know the storm she had just set in motion. As darkness began to settle, a single sprinkler on the neighbor's lawn coughed twice and then died. A water tap down the block sputtered and let out nothing but air. The first signs of their mistake had already begun. And in his house, the homeowner leaned back in his chair, the phone glowing softly in his hand, calm and steady. They thought they could bury his well and end it there. But he wasn't just going to get his water back. He was going to make sure they understood exactly who they had picked a fight with. Karen walked into the HOA office the next morning with the kind of walk she used when she thought she had one. Her heels struck the tile floor like little hammers, and the faint sound echoed through the small hallway. She had spent the entire night feeling pleased with herself, replaying the image of the wet concrete sealing the well, the look on the man's face when he saw it. She thought that would be the end of it. She believed she had reminded the entire neighborhood who ran this place. In her mind, the rules were the law, and she was the one who decided how those rules were used. But what she didn't know was that her so-called victory had already set something in motion that she wouldn't be able to control. By the time she sat down at the board table, emails were already flooding in. Residents were complaining that their water pressure had dropped overnight. Some said their faucets were barely dripping. Others said their sprinklers had completely died. She scrolled through the messages, frowning but not yet worried. At first, she assumed it was a city problem, a temporary glitch. But the HOA board members sitting around the table didn't look calm. A few had panic in their eyes. One of them leaned forward and said in a low voice, Karen, something's wrong with the main line. We've never had this kind of drop before. She waved him off with a sharp flick of her hand. Relax. It's probably just maintenance. The city handles the supply. We have backups. It'll be fine. But even as she said it, a small knot twisted in her stomach. She opened another message from a family at the edge of the neighborhood. No water at all. None. When will this be fixed? The timestamp was early morning. She checked the next email. Our pool pump shut off. Zero pressure. Another one. Lawn irrigation systems are dry. What's going on? The knot got tighter. Meanwhile, across the street, the homeowner sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, calm and quiet. His lawn wasn't green from the city line. He had kept a small backup water tank buried under the ground, a habit left from years of living on that land before any HOA existed. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't writing emails. He was just watching as the neighborhood slowly realized how dependent they had always been on the thing Karen had destroyed. And he didn't need to lift a finger. Karen finally picked up the phone and called the water department. The call lasted only a few minutes, but when she hung up, her face had lost its smugness. The city didn't handle the neighborhood's supply directly. They never had. Years ago, the original developer had built the neighborhood on private lines that fed through the land where the well sat today. That well wasn't just his source of water. It was their source too. She didn't say anything to the board members at first. She didn't want to admit she had made a mistake. But silence in a room full of nervous people grows heavy fast. One of them asked again, Karen? What's going on? She clenched her jaw. We're working on it, she lied. But outside, the signs of the problem were spreading like a quiet storm. Lawns began to wither. Pools started to drain. People walked outside holding empty watering cans and confused expressions. A few neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, talking in low voices. Everyone knew something was wrong. And the man sitting on his porch? He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Karen spent the next hour on the phone, trying to find a way to fix something she didn't even understand. The company that had originally installed the lines no longer operated. The HOA never invested in their own independent system because they had never needed to. Everything had always flowed through the well. It was cheaper, easier, and now it was gone. When Karen finally looked out the window of the office, she saw neighbors gathered in clusters on the street, pointing toward the patch of concrete at the edge of the man's property. The concrete shimmered in the heat, gray and hard, sealing their lifeline beneath it. The very thing she had ordered to be buried had turned into the center of every whispered conversation. One neighbor shook his head slowly and muttered just loud enough for others to hear, "She's the one who did it." Another added, "She's always pushing people too far." The mood on the street was changing. Fear was turning into frustration. Karen grabbed her clipboard and marched outside, trying to look like she had everything under control. "Everyone calm down," she snapped, walking toward the crowd. "The city is just having some issues with the line. We'll have water back soon." But the crowd didn't respond with the usual quiet nods. Instead, someone crossed their arms and said, "Are you sure about that?" Another person asked, "Why were those trucks here yesterday? Why did you fill the well?" Karen's heart beat a little faster. She didn't like being questioned. She wasn't used to it. Usually, when she raised her voice, people backed off. But today, the heat was thick, the taps were dry, and the smiles were gone. "This is temporary," she insisted, but her words carried less weight now. One of the older neighbors stepped forward. "Karen," he said in a flat voice, "that well's been here longer than this HOA. You didn't just remove something ugly. You cut off the thing we all depend on." She snapped back, "That's not true. The city supplies," but he cut her off with a sharp look. "No. You know that's not how this works." Her chest tightened. She could feel the power slipping through her hands like water she couldn't grab. She glanced toward the man's house. He was still there on the porch, sipping his coffee, completely untouched by the chaos. And worst of all, the neighbors noticed it too. Someone whispered, "He still has water, doesn't he?" Another person muttered, He always said we were depending on his line. Their voices grew louder, like rising waves. She took a step back, clutching her clipboard tightly. She wasn't just the woman who fined people for lawn ornaments anymore. She was the one who had caused the water to stop. The woman who had turned her own neighborhood against itself. By midday, the HOA phone line was ringing nonstop. Emails piled up. People demanded answers. Karen called the contractor who had done the job and barked orders at them to fix it. But they told her they didn't have the clearance to dig on private property again. Not without the owner's consent. And he wasn't giving it. She slammed the phone down hard enough that the sound echoed through the empty office. She told herself she was still in control. But she wasn't. The entire neighborhood was slowly realizing what she had done. And there was no letter, no rulebook, no clipboard that could save her this time. The man leaned back on his porch chair and watched the HOA Queen's castle crack, one small fracture at a time. The heat grew hotter, the lawns grew drier, and Karen's fake smile grew thinner. And for the first time since she had taken power, she felt something she had never felt before. Fear. Real, cold fear. Because this time, she couldn't fine or threaten her way out of the mess she had created. By the third day, the heat felt heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on the entire neighborhood, and the air itself carried a kind of tension no one could ignore anymore. The lawns that had once been perfectly trimmed and deep green had turned patchy and brittle. Sprinklers stayed silent, pools sat half-drained, and the sound of running water, a sound everyone had taken for granted, was gone. The HOA office was no longer the quiet, controlled place where Karen barked orders and everyone nodded. It had become a battlefield of ringing phones, angry emails, and neighbors at the door demanding answers she didn't have. Karen sat at her desk, her hands gripping her clipboard like it could still give her the authority she was losing hour by hour. Sweat ran down her back even in the air conditioning. Every time the phone rang, it made her flinch. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. When will the water come back? She didn't have an answer. She told them the same line over and over, "We're working on it." But each time it sounded weaker, more desperate. Outside, clusters of neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, talking in low but angry voices. People who had once been too afraid to even complain about a letter from the HOA were now shouting at each other and pointing toward the patch of concrete where the well had been buried. It had become a symbol. A hard, gray reminder of who had caused all this. Karen peeked through the blinds and saw them out there, their faces shiny with sweat, their clothes sticking to their backs, frustration etched into every line. She heard someone yell, "She did this." Another shouted, "She better fix it." It was no longer quiet frustration. It was open rage now, and it was growing. Across the street, the homeowner sat in his chair on the porch, calm and still. He wasn't sweating like the others because he had prepared. His backup tank still gave him enough water for the essentials, and that made everything worse for Karen. Every time someone noticed how calm he was, their anger toward her grew sharper. He didn't need to say a word. His silence was enough. People had started to put the pieces together. They remembered how the well had always been there, how during past droughts, they had never really run out of water. Some of the older residents knew the truth. The developer had cut costs decades ago and tied the neighborhood's supply through that well. They had always depended on it. Everyone had. The HOA had just pretended they were in charge, but it had never really been them. It was him. It had always been him. Karen's stomach churned as she watched her fake power collapse piece by piece. She picked up the phone again and called the city, hoping for some kind of lifeline, but they told her the same thing they'd said before. The neighborhood didn't run on city water. It ran on a private system. And the well she had filled with concrete? It was legally protected private property. They couldn't touch it without the owner's permission. And she didn't have it. She slammed the phone down, her hands trembling now, not from rage but from something colder, fear. She looked at the stack of violation letters on her desk, the little pieces of paper that had always given her control. For years, all it took was a single letter for people to obey her. She fined them, threatened legal action, made their lives miserable if they didn't follow her rules. But none of that mattered anymore. She couldn't find her way out of this. She couldn't send a letter to turn the water back on. Across the neighborhood, panic was spreading. People were filling buckets with bottled water. Kids cried in backyards when their plastic pools stayed empty. Elderly residents who relied on running water were starting to complain louder. The HOA board members, who had once blindly backed Karen in every vote, were now turning on her too. Two of them cornered her in the office and demanded answers. "Why did you do this without a meeting?" one of them asked. "You had no right to fill that well." "I had every right," Karen snapped back, but her voice was too high, too shaky. "It was an unapproved structure. That well was the only reason we ever had water during the last drought." The other board member cut in, his voice hard. "You destroyed something we depended on." She felt her throat tighten. She wanted to scream at them, to remind them who had led this board for years. But deep down, she could feel it. The balance had shifted. She wasn't feared anymore. She was blamed. Outside, more neighbors were gathering. Someone was handing out cases of bottled water, and every single person who took one turned their eyes toward her office like it was the enemy. Someone muttered, "She better fix this or she's done." The crowd grew. The heat baked the pavement. The sound of cicadas in the trees only made the silence of dead pipes louder. And then came the first real crack in her voice when she finally called the contractor. She begged them to undo what they had done, to get the concrete out, to fix the pipes. But they told her no. They didn't have permission from the property owner. "Then get it," she snapped. But the man on the other end of the line laughed softly and said, "Lady, I don't think he's gonna give you anything." And he was right. Across the street, the homeowner wasn't answering calls. He wasn't yelling at anyone. He was just watching. Calm. Patient. Waiting. He didn't need to do anything. All the chaos was doing the work for him. That night, the HOA office lights burned late. But the neighborhood stayed dark and thirsty. People stopped pretending to respect her. They didn't lower their voices anymore when they talked about her. They didn't hide their anger. She had gone from the woman who controlled everything to the woman everyone blamed. She walked home that night with her clipboard hanging uselessly at her side, sweat dripping from her temples, her steps heavy. The smell of dry, hot air filled the street. A garden hose lay on the curb, cracked from heat, useless. She stopped in front of the concrete patch covering the well. It gleamed under the streetlights, hard and cold. She knelt down and touched the edge with her fingertips. For the first time, she felt how solid it was. How final. A chill ran through her even in the heat. She had built her power on fear, and she had used it like a weapon. But she had never faced what it would be like when the fear turned against her. She stood slowly, straightened her blazer, and looked at the silent houses around her. For years, they had listened to her. Now they were watching her fall. And she knew it. She whispered under her breath, "This isn't over." But the truth was already written in the silence of dry taps and cracking lawns. This time, it was her corner that was getting smaller, and his power, quiet, steady, unshakable, was only growing. By the third day, the heat felt like it was sitting on top of the entire neighborhood, pressing down on everything. The lawns that had once been perfect were fading fast. Sprinklers were nothing but useless plastic pipes sticking out of the ground, and swimming pools had turned into dry, cracked bowls. People dragged their garden hoses around like they were broken lifelines, turning faucets and hearing nothing but dry air hissing through the pipes. The HOA office, which used to be the center of power, was now a cornered space filled with ringing phones, angry knocks on the door, and the sound of Karen pacing like a trapped animal. She had spent years enjoying the feeling of control. She used to walk into meetings like a queen, speak with a voice that people never dared to interrupt, wave violation letters like weapons. But now, for the first time, she wasn't getting silent obedience, she was getting fury. Every call that came in was the same. "When is the water coming back? What are you going to do? You caused this." She sat behind her desk gripping the edges so tightly her knuckles were white. Her expensive watch ticked loudly in the silence between phone calls, a sound that felt heavier with each second. She tried to tell herself she still had control, that this was temporary. But when she looked out the blinds and saw the growing groups of neighbors standing together under the blistering sun, glaring toward the concrete slab where the well had once been, she felt a cold, twisting weight in her stomach. People weren't whispering anymore. They were shouting. Someone yelled across the street that this was all her fault. Another shouted that she'd gone too far this time. And then there was the worst part of it all. The man she had tried to humiliate sat calmly on his porch every single day, a glass of cold water in his hand, not saying a single word. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to point fingers. He didn't need to prove anything. The neighborhood was doing that for him. Everyone had figured it out. They always knew, deep down, that the HOA wasn't truly supplying their water. The developer years ago had built this place to run through that private well because it was cheaper. Everyone had relied on it for decades, and Karen, in all her arrogance, had destroyed it without understanding what she had touched. She thought she was burying his independence. Instead, she buried the whole neighborhood's lifeline. Now the anger wasn't quiet anymore. It was growing like a fire. Mothers with crying children shouted about how they couldn't bathe their kids. Gardeners cursed because their plants had turned brown. Elderly residents who relied on water for basic needs were furious. It wasn't just a problem anymore. It was a full-blown revolt. Karen stood in front of the mirror in her office bathroom and stared at her reflection. Her hair was out of place. The perfect image she always presented cracked. Her blazer, usually crisp and sharp, was sticking to her skin with sweat. Her face looked tight and tired. She didn't look like the woman who handed out fines with a smile. She looked like someone trapped by her own mistake. She left the mirror and went back to the desk where the board members were waiting, but they weren't her loyal followers anymore. Their faces were pale, angry, and accusing. One of them slammed his palm on the table and said, "You've made a disaster. You did this without a vote, without even asking us." Another said sharply, "That well was registered. You didn't even check before sending the trucks." She tried to snap back like she always did, but her voice came out thin and forced. "I followed the rules. That well was not approved by the HOA. It's against community standards." One of them laughed bitterly. "Community standards? You destroyed the only thing keeping this place running. Do you even realize what you've done?" She felt a heat crawl up the back of her neck. She wanted to yell, to shut them up like she always did. But she couldn't. Not when every single tap in the neighborhood was dry. Not when every single eye out there was looking at her. Across the street, the man on the porch leaned back in his chair, watching everything. His quiet made her angrier than any insult could have. She picked up the phone and called the contractor again, demanding that they break the concrete and restore the well. But the man on the other end of the line didn't care about her panic. He told her they couldn't touch private property without the owner's permission. She tried to order him like she ordered everyone else, but he laughed and said, "Lady, you don't own the well. You buried something that wasn't yours. That's on you." She slammed the phone down so hard the board members jumped. Outside, the neighborhood gathered again. It wasn't a meeting. It wasn't planned. It was anger bringing people together. She could hear them through the walls. Someone shouted that the HOA was finished. Someone else said they were done being controlled. Karen's hands shook as she pulled the blinds to look outside. The sun was hitting the concrete slab hard, making it shine like a wound in the earth. The neighbors were no longer scattered or quiet. They were united. Even the ones who used to support her weren't standing by her anymore. Some of them had arms crossed, others were holding empty buckets or bottles, all of them glaring at the house that had water and the woman who had taken it away from them. She thought about the power she used to have. How she'd send one letter and everyone would obey. How people had been too scared to fight back. But now the fear had shifted. No one feared her. They hated her. And that was worse. She finally walked outside because she couldn't stay trapped in that office. The heat slapped her face as soon as she opened the door. The crowd turned toward her immediately. She forced her usual fake smile, the one she used in every meeting. "We are working on a solution," she said loudly, but her voice didn't sound confident. It sounded weak, shaky. Someone shouted from the back of the crowd, "You destroyed our water." Another person yelled, "Why should we trust you now?" Karen's fake smile cracked. The contractor is handling it, she lied, but everyone saw right through it. The old man across the street stepped forward. He had lived here longer than anyone, and his voice was calm but hard. No contractor can fix what you buried. Only he can, he said, pointing toward the man on the porch. Every head turned to look at him. He sat there, calm, untouched by the chaos. And that was when Karen felt something she hadn't felt in years. Powerlessness. Real, cold, quiet powerlessness. She walked back inside as the crowd shouted after her. Her clipboard hung limp at her side. All the years she had spent building her little kingdom of rules and fines were falling apart faster than she could speak. Inside, she leaned against the wall, breathing hard. This wasn't just about a well anymore. This was about every line she'd crossed, every neighbor she'd pushed, every ounce of control she'd stolen. They were done fearing her. And deep down, she knew this storm had only just begun to be why the fourth day. The neighborhood didn't feel like the quiet, polished community it once was. It felt like a pressure cooker. The air was thick with heat and frustration. The sound of laughter and sprinklers that used to fill summer afternoons had vanished completely, replaced by silence and the crackle of dry grass underfoot. The lawns looked like dead carpets, gardens hung limp, flower beds turned to dust, and the swimming pools that had once shimmered like blue jewels in the sun were cracked and chalky, some with a layer of dust blowing across them like sand in a desert. The HOA office had become a fortress under siege. People didn't just call anymore. They showed up. They pounded on the doors, shouted through the windows, demanded answers she didn't have. Karen had stopped wearing her usual blazer. It was too hot, too heavy, and more than that, the look of authority it once gave her didn't work anymore. It was useless now. Her hair was tied messily, and the clipboard she carried like a badge of power now looked like a flimsy piece of wood. For years, she had walked these streets like she owned them. She made people repaint fences, remove wind chimes, cut down trees she thought didn't fit the image. She fined people for parking on the wrong side, for leaving holiday decorations up too long, for daring to live freely. But this was different. No letter could fix this. No warning could intimidate this problem away. The well she buried wasn't just a piece of someone's property. It was the artery that kept the whole neighborhood alive, and she was the one who cut it. And everyone knew. When she stepped outside the office that morning, she was met by dozens of furious faces. Not a single one smiled. Not a single one looked uncertain anymore. The fear she had relied on for so long was gone. In its place was something heavier, something louder. Anger. A woman from 2 streets down shouted, "My kids haven't had a proper shower in 3 days." Another man pointed at the dead brown grass under his feet and yelled, "My business depends on my lawn being perfect. Do you know what this is costing me?" Someone else shouted, "She filled it. She did this." Karen tried to speak, but the noise of the crowd swallowed her voice. Across the street, the man she had tried to humiliate stood by his porch. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't even smiling. He just watched. Calm. Steady. A glass of cold water sat on the porch railing beside him. Everyone noticed it. They noticed how the only house on the street that still had water was his. And that realization made the crowd even louder. "She tried to control him and now she's made us pay for it," someone shouted. "She never cared about the neighborhood, just her rules," another yelled. Karen felt every word like a blow to the chest. Her control was slipping like sand through her fingers. She opened her mouth and forced her voice to rise above the shouting. "The situation is under control," she said, but even she didn't believe herself. Her voice was shaky, thin, and the crowd laughed bitterly. A tall man stepped forward from the back, his face red from the heat and anger. "Under control," he barked. "Do you hear yourself? We have no water. Not a single drop. We trusted you to keep this place running. And what did you do? You buried the only thing keeping us alive in this heat." Karen stiffened, trying to keep her fake authority. "I followed HOA standards," she snapped. "That well wasn't approved." The crowd erupted into a roar of frustration. One woman shouted, "We don't drink your stupid rules." Someone else added, Your rules don't water our kids. They weren't scared anymore. They were ready to tear down everything she built. And for the first time, Karen couldn't hide behind policies. The man on the porch didn't move, but his silence was louder than the crowd. They all knew he had the power now. Not because he fought for it, but because she had given it to him with her arrogance. He didn't need to say a single word. The neighborhood had already chosen who to listen to. Karen turned and stormed back inside the HOA building, slamming the door shut as the shouts followed her. She leaned against the door, breathing hard. Her hands were shaking, not from rage, but from the terrifying realization that she had no control anymore. Not over the situation, not over the people, not even over her own board. When she turned around, 2 board members were standing there waiting. Their faces said it all. They weren't backing her anymore. "We need to call him," one of them said flatly. She frowned. "Who?" "Him," the other one said, nodding toward the porch visible through the window. "The well owner. The one you tried to break. He's the only one who can fix this. The water department won't touch private property without him." Karen's jaw tightened. "I'm not begging him," she hissed. "You might not have to beg," one of them said coldly. "But we will. Because if this doesn't get fixed soon, this neighborhood is done. And so is this board." And then they walked past her, leaving her standing alone in the empty office. She gripped her clipboard so tight her knuckles turned white. Begging him was the last thing she wanted to do. For years, she had made him her favorite target. She'd fined him for improper fencing, for unauthorized structures, for simply refusing to bend to her authority. She had always wanted to make him a warning to others. Instead, she had made him untouchable. When she finally forced herself to look out the window, she saw 2 board members already walking across the street toward his house. She saw how the neighbors quieted down a little, not for her, but for him. People respected him in a way they had never respected her. They didn't fear him, they trusted him. That trust was something she could never buy or enforce with rules. It was earned over years, and she had burned it with arrogance in a single day. The 2 board members stopped at the edge of his porch. He didn't stand. He didn't rush to greet them. He let them come to him, calm and silent. One of them spoke, and she couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language. They weren't ordering him. They were asking, then pleading. The man leaned back in his chair, sipping from his glass of water slowly, letting the moment stretch. The crowd outside grew quieter as they watched. Karen's hands clenched at her sides as she realized what she was seeing. This was the shift. The control she had spent years building with fines, threats, and fake authority had vanished. It had moved across the street, to a man who didn't want it, didn't need it, but had it anyway because she had handed it to him the moment she poured that concrete. And he hadn't even lifted a finger. The man finally spoke. The board members listened. One of them nodded quickly. The other wiped sweat from his forehead. They walked away looking smaller than when they'd approached. The crowd buzzed with whispers. Karen's chest burned with humiliation. She had spent years making sure no one ever challenged her. And now, she was the one standing behind a door, watching everything crumble. That night, as the sun set and the concrete over the well turned cold and gray under the streetlights, the neighborhood knew one thing for sure: she wasn't in charge anymore. Not of the water. Not of the people. Not of anything. She had started a war she couldn't win. And tomorrow, she would face something even worse than their anger. She would face her own humiliation to be why the 5th day. The neighborhood didn't feel tense anymore. It felt like it was standing on the edge of something that was about to break. The heat had only gotten worse, baking the concrete roads until they shimmered like silver ribbons. The once perfect lawns now looked like brittle hay, fences warped from the relentless sun, and even the air felt dry enough to crack. Everyone was tired, sweaty, frustrated, and more than anything else, they were done listening to the HOA. The angry whispers that had started days ago were now full-blown confrontations. People weren't hiding their feelings anymore. Neighbors who used to keep their heads down were now standing in front yards, waving their empty buckets, shouting at each other and at anyone wearing an HOA badge. Every eye in the neighborhood knew exactly who was to blame. And Karen felt it every second she stepped outside. She walked down the street with her clipboard tucked against her chest like a useless shield. She tried to keep her chin up, tried to walk like she still had power, but it was different now. The looks she got weren't scared or nervous anymore. They were cold, sharp, full of quiet fury. Some people didn't bother hiding it. They crossed their arms, narrowed their eyes, and muttered loud enough for her to hear. That's her. She filled it. She did this to us. She walked faster, not out of pride but because every step felt heavier than the last. At the corner, she saw something she never thought she'd see in this neighborhood. Neighbors who had never spoken much to each other were working together, dragging hoses, carrying bottles, trying to share what little water they had stored. A few people had driven outside the neighborhood to fill barrels at stations in town, and now they were giving it out to families with children and the elderly. They weren't looking to the HOA for help anymore. They were helping each other. And they weren't hiding their disgust when she walked past. Karen clenched her jaw. For years, she had built this place on control. She liked it when they followed rules. She liked it when they came to her for permission. And now she was nothing to them. They didn't need her. They didn't want her. She passed the old man who used to always nod politely to her during board meetings. The one she fined for painting his porch the wrong shade of beige. He didn't even look at her. He was busy helping a young couple fill buckets with what little water they had collected from portable tanks. A small child tugged at his arm, and he laughed, a warm, real laugh, the kind she had never been able to inspire with her fake HOA speeches. She hated how invisible she suddenly felt. Not feared. Not respected. Just irrelevant. And then her eyes fell on the porch across the street. He was there. The man she had tried to humiliate. The man whose well she had buried. He was sitting in that same chair, calm as always, with a glass of cold water in his hand. His house looked like a quiet island in the middle of chaos. A small generator hummed softly, and she could see the faint shimmer of water pipes from his backup system. He didn't brag. He didn't yell. He didn't even need to stand. His silence spoke louder than anything else. Everyone knew he was the key to ending this. And everyone also knew she was the one who would have to crawl to him to fix it. The two board members who had gone to talk to him the day before were back in the HOA office now, waiting for her. When she walked in, she saw the look on their faces. It wasn't just disappointment anymore. It was something worse. Finality. One of them dropped a thick folder on the table with a heavy thud. "The state sent this," he said. "You really screwed up." She frowned. "What is it?" "Proof," the other said sharply. "Proof that the well was legally registered and protected. Proof that what you did was illegal. Proof that we, as an HOA, are on the hook for this mess." Her hands tightened around her clipboard. "You mean you let me do my job?" she snapped defensively. "You all backed me before. Don't act like this was just me." The board member leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You ordered the trucks, Karen. You signed the work order. You didn't call for a vote. You didn't check with anyone. You wanted to make an example of him. Well, congratulations. You did." She looked down at the documents, and her throat went dry. Official state seals, legal warnings, heavy words like violations, liability, and penalties covered the pages. She wasn't just dealing with angry neighbors anymore. She was dealing with the state. And worse, she didn't have a way out. The water department had already made it clear they wouldn't touch the well. The only person who could reverse what had been done was the owner himself. The man she had mocked, fined, and tried to control. The man she had made into an enemy. Her head started to pound. She turned to the board, but they didn't look like allies anymore. They looked like people waiting for her to fail. "You're going to fix this," one of them said flatly. "You're going to talk to him. Not us. Not the city. You. Because you did this." She wanted to scream at them, but the truth was too solid to escape. This was her doing. Her arrogance. Her mistake. She walked back outside, feeling every step like it was dragging her deeper into something she couldn't control. The crowd had grown again, bigger than ever. Some were standing with their arms crossed. Others were sitting on their dry lawns, fanning themselves, waiting for something to change. They saw her walking toward his porch, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. No one shouted. No one cursed. They just watched. She hated that feeling more than anything. When she reached his porch, he didn't even move. He sat there with his elbows resting on the armrests, calm, collected, and untouchable. His eyes met hers with a quiet weight that made her feel smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. "We need to talk," she said, forcing her voice to sound steady. He didn't say anything. He didn't nod or shake his head. He just waited. That silence dug into her like a knife. For years, she had been the one who made people squirm. Now the tables had turned, and she hated every second of it. She swallowed hard. "The neighborhood, the board, we need your help," she finally said. The words tasted like poison. She had spent years making sure she'd never have to say anything like that to anyone, especially to him. He took a slow sip of his water, set the glass down, and then leaned forward. "Now you need me," he said softly. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She could feel every pair of eyes from the street on her. Neighbors who had been afraid to look her in the eye were now watching with satisfaction as the queen of rules and fines was forced to bend her neck. "You destroyed something that wasn't yours," he continued, his voice still quiet. "And now you expect me to fix it for you." Her throat felt like sand. She didn't want to beg, but she had no choice. "Please," she said finally, the word cutting into her pride like a blade. "If you don't help, this neighborhood falls apart." He tilted his head slightly. "This neighborhood didn't fall apart because of me," he said. "It fell apart because of you." Her eyes burned, not from tears but from rage and humiliation. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. He had already won. She had built her little empire on fear. But fear only worked when people had no other choice. Now, they had a choice. And it wasn't her. She clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to say the words she never thought she would speak. "What do you want?" He didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, letting the silence stretch until it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. Then, slowly, he gave a small, calm smile, not the cruel kind she often used, but one of someone who knew the power was finally where it belonged. "I'll help," he said. But from this point on, things change. And everyone watching knew what that meant. Her reign was over. By the 6th day, the heat had settled into the neighborhood like a curse. The sky had no clouds, the wind carried no coolness, and the ground itself looked like it was begging for water. The lawns were no longer just brown. They were brittle, crunching under the weight of footsteps. People's tempers had dried out the same way their gardens had. Everyone was tired of waiting. Tired of excuses. Tired of Karen. And for the first time, the HOA president who once ruled every block with fines and threats now moved like a shadow in a neighborhood she no longer controlled. The moment she walked outside, she felt the shift in the air. Nobody lowered their heads when she passed anymore. Nobody avoided eye contact. Their stares followed her like sharp knives. Groups of neighbors were gathered in every corner, sharing whispers that didn't sound like fear. They sounded like unity. People had stopped caring about HOA rules. They didn't care about lawn colors, mailbox heights, or community image. All they cared about now was survival. And the person who held their future wasn't Karen anymore. It was the man sitting calmly on his porch, the one whose well she had buried in her arrogance. When she stepped onto the street that morning, she saw a crowd already forming. It wasn't a protest. It was worse than that. It was quiet. Controlled. People were standing shoulder to shoulder with the kind of determination that made her skin prickle. It wasn't noise anymore. It was power. And she wasn't part of it. She was the reason it existed. The board members who had once followed her now stood at the edge of the crowd, not beside her, but facing her. They didn't wear the same loyal expressions. They looked at her like a problem that needed to be removed. Her name used to silence people. Now, it only made them angrier. As she crossed the street, The man didn't even stand up. He sat in that same wooden chair, elbows resting on the armrests, a glass of cold water in his hand. Even the way the condensation rolled down the side of the glass felt like a statement. He didn't have to say anything. He already had everything he needed. For the first time in years, she felt small in her own neighborhood. She approached the porch slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her heart pounded, not from fear of him, but from the knowledge that everyone behind her was watching, and this time they weren't on her side. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, trying to hold on to whatever fragments of authority she still had. Her voice came out tighter than she intended. "The board has agreed to work with you," she said. He didn't answer. He took a slow sip from the glass, his eyes calm but sharp, the way someone looks at a storm they already know they can control. "We'll reverse everything," she added, trying to sound firm but failing miserably. "We'll do whatever's necessary to restore the well." "You already did whatever was necessary," he said quietly. "You destroyed it." The words landed like stones in her chest. She hated that calm tone even more than she would have hated shouting. He didn't raise his voice because he didn't need to. She swallowed hard. The crowd behind her was silent, watching her every move. It was like they were waiting for something to snap. "We're asking for your help," she forced out, her pride bleeding with every word. "If the well isn't restored, the entire neighborhood loses everything. We'll pay for the work. The board will sign whatever needs to be signed. We just need your permission to move forward." He leaned back slowly in his chair, the faint creak of the wood the only sound in the hot air. "You don't just need my permission," he said. "You need me." She flinched slightly. He wasn't wrong. Even the state inspector had made it clear. The well was his, legally and fully. The HOA had zero power without him. Her clipboard, once the symbol of her control, now felt like a useless piece of plastic hanging limply at her side. She hated every second of this. "Then tell me what you want," she muttered. But he shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "This isn't about what I want. This is about what's fair." He turned his head slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "For years, you fined people for nothing. You bullied them with rules you barely understood. You made life harder for people who just wanted to live. And then, when someone didn't bend to your control, you tried to destroy the one thing you couldn't touch. You didn't just hurt me, Karen. You hurt everyone." She opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Her throat felt dry, like the dead grass under her shoes. "This neighborhood depended on that well for years," he continued. "But you never cared to understand that. You thought it was about your power. It never was." The silence around them was so deep she could hear her own breathing. The crowd didn't make a sound. They didn't interrupt. They wanted to hear this. All of it. She shifted uneasily, trying to keep her shoulders straight, but the weight of the moment pushed down on her like the burning sun above them. "So here's how this is going to work," he said calmly. "The well will be restored, but I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for everyone else. And when it's done, things will change. No more letters. No more fines for people who hang wind chimes. No more acting like you own people's lives. I'll make sure of it." Her stomach turned. She had spent years controlling every corner of this neighborhood. And now, in one brutal moment, she was losing everything. He didn't ask for a deal. He set the terms. She had no power left to negotiate. "If you don't agree," he added, his voice still steady, "the well stays buried. The state won't touch it without me. The HOA will drown in fines. And this place will dry up for good." She could feel the crowd behind her, hundreds of eyes boring into her back. She knew they would turn on her completely if she didn't say yes. She could already feel their anger vibrating in the air like heat off the road. Her throat was tight, her pride screaming at her to fight, but there was nothing left to fight with. She nodded stiffly. "Fine," she whispered. He raised an eyebrow. "Say it properly." She clenched her jaw. "I agree," she said louder this time, the words tasting like ash. "You'll have full control over the restoration." He didn't smile, not even a little. He just nodded once, slow and calm. Good. Then we start tomorrow. As she turned to walk back, she saw the faces in the crowd. Some of them were smiling, not out of joy but out of pure relief that someone had finally stood up to her. Others just looked tired, but there was a spark of hope in their eyes that hadn't been there in days. None of them looked at her with fear anymore. Not one. She walked away slowly, the clipboard heavy in her hand, her steps dragging against the dry ground. The power she had once held over this place had crumbled into dust, just like the lawns around her. She had built her little kingdom on rules and fear, and now she was walking through the ruins of it. Behind her, the man remained seated on the porch, calm as always. He didn't celebrate. He didn't mock her. He didn't need to. He had won without ever raising his voice. And the neighborhood knew it. They didn't belong to her anymore. They belonged to themselves. And tomorrow, when the well returned, she would no longer be the ruler of this place. She would be just another name on a list of people who had pushed too far and lost everything. By the seventh day, the neighborhood felt like a storm was finally about to break. The air was still hot, but it carried something different now, a pulse of anticipation. People weren't standing around helpless anymore. They were waiting. Trucks with equipment were parked on the street, not HOA trucks this time, but state-authorized restoration crews brought in through the man who owned the well. The same well Karen had tried to bury forever. The same well that had once been silent but was now the center of everyone's attention. Early in the morning, people gathered on sidewalks, leaning against fences, holding cold drinks, wiping sweat from their foreheads as they watched the crew work. The tension of the past week sat thick over everything like a heavy blanket, but beneath it, there was also something else, hope. Not for Karen, not for the HOA, but for themselves. The restoration wasn't led by her, and everyone knew it. The homeowner stood calmly beside the well site, hands on his hips, watching every movement like a quiet storm. The men in vests and hard hats didn't answer to Karen. They answered to him. Even the board members who had once stood behind Karen now hovered awkwardly on the edges of the crowd, unsure of their place. For years, Karen had been the center of every HOA meeting, every decision, every argument. She was the one people whispered about, feared, avoided. But today, she was just standing in the background, invisible, clutching her clipboard like a broken crown. No one cared what she had to say anymore. No one asked her for direction. Not a single person looked at her for leadership. That power was gone, pulled from her hands like sand through open fingers. And it wasn't coming back. When the crew cracked through the thick layer of concrete she had ordered poured, there was a hush. Everyone leaned in a little closer. The sound of the jackhammers echoed down the street, sharp and clear. Dust filled the air. The gray slab that had symbolized her control shattered piece by piece until the old steel well cap was revealed underneath. Someone in the crowd let out a small cheer, then another followed, and then more until the whole street was buzzing with quiet celebration. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was steady, powerful, a moment that meant something to all of them. Karen stood a few feet away, frozen. That slab had been her victory less than a week ago. She had stood right here, smug and smiling, watching the workers bury his well, believing she had finally broken him. And now, she was watching that same slab get destroyed like it was nothing more than a mistake written in wet cement. She felt the weight of every neighbor's eye on her, not afraid, not submissive, but sharp and judging. She could almost hear their thoughts. You did this. You tried to control everything. And now you've lost it all. One of the board members leaned toward another and whispered, but they didn't bother hiding it. This is how it should have been handled from the start, he said. Karen clenched the clipboard in her hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The homeowner didn't even glance at her. He gave quiet instructions to the crew. They moved quickly, methodically. They knew exactly what to do because this wasn't the first time they'd restored something like this. Within hours, the well was open again, the pipes checked, the connections repaired. And then it happened, the sound that the neighborhood had been waiting for. A deep, hollow rush, followed by the steady hiss of water moving through pipes again. A sound so normal and yet so powerful that people actually started clapping. It wasn't wild or forced. It was real. It was relief. Someone turned a hose on their lawn and watched water flow out like a miracle. Children laughed as they stuck their hands under it, feeling cool water for the first time in days. A woman wiped tears from her eyes. A few neighbors cheered for the crew. But the loudest thing of all was what wasn't being said. No one thanked the HOA. No one looked at Karen. All eyes went to him. The man who had quietly sat on his porch while the entire neighborhood turned to dust. The man who hadn't needed to fight with threats or speeches. The man who now owned the respect that she had once forced out of fear. Karen watched the crowd. She saw how people stood closer to each other, talking in low, relieved voices, no longer afraid of breaking a rule or getting a fine. She saw how the children played in the water, how parents smiled again, how the whole neighborhood seemed to breathe for the first time in a week. They weren't looking at her like she mattered anymore. She was a ghost with a clipboard in a place that had moved on without her. The board members didn't even try to defend her. One of them walked up to the homeowner, shook his hand firmly, and thanked him in front of everyone. Another followed. Then a few neighbors. Karen felt something inside her crack as she watched him nod politely, as if their gratitude wasn't even something he needed. He didn't ask for power. He didn't demand it. But it belonged to him now. And everyone knew it. She turned away, trying to hold her head high, but she couldn't. Not with every conversation drifting right past her like she wasn't even there. Her rules had always been a cage around them, but now that they'd tasted what it felt like to break free, there was no way to put them back inside. Later that evening, the sun dipped low, painting the street in gold. The well sat open and strong again, humming softly with the sound of flowing water beneath. Neighbors were gathered in front yards, some with drinks in hand, others watering their dry gardens, smiling for the first time in a long time. The man sat on his porch again, just like always, except now people were walking up to him, patting his shoulder, nodding their thanks. Karen stood alone across the street in the shadow of the HOA building. The clipboard hung at her side like a dead weight. She had built her little kingdom on control, but it only took one mistake for it to all come crashing down. No one feared her anymore. No one cared about her rules. She was no longer the queen of the neighborhood, just the reminder of how power built on fear crumbles the moment people stop believing in it. As the night grew cooler, the sound of running water filled the air again. It was ordinary, simple, beautiful. It was everything she had tried to control and failed. And standing in the dark, she finally understood. The neighborhood didn't belong to her. It never had. It belonged to the people. And she had lost them forever.